The war chamber of the galactic conclave smelled like a dozen dying stars, each alien species carrying its own atmospheric signature, a cocktail of methane, ozone, and something that humans would have described simply as wrong. But there were no humans in this room. That was rather the point. Admiral Voskith of the Dravari hegemony stood at the head of the obsidian table, his four upper limbs folded behind his ridge-plated back, and smiled the way predators smile when the prey doesn't know it's being watched. He was 8 feet of armored confidence, and he had just pulled up the intelligence file on the species designated Sol-3, colloquially known, in the lower dialects, as the Mudwalkers. He flicked the file across the holographic table like a man, discarding a losing hand of cards. 40 years, he said. They have been spacefaring for 40 years. Laughter moved around the table like a warm current. Captain Corlin of the Lethani Combine, a being that resembled a cathedral made of coral, clicked his feeding appendages in amusement. Hethnira of the Sorathi Pact, sleek and silver and permanently bored-looking, didn't even bother to glance at the file. Relax, the cold-eyed commander of the Merchant Syndicate's military arm, simply leaned back and let the laughter wash over him without participating. He had a habit of not laughing at things before he understood them. It was a habit that had kept him alive through 3 wars. The file on Sol-3 was, by any galactic standard, unimpressive. A single inhabited planet, though they'd colonized a handful of moons and 2 marginal outer worlds in the last decade. A navy that numbered fewer than 200 registered vessels. A species biologically fragile, short-lived, soft-bodied, dependent on a narrow temperature band, susceptible to radiation, and prone to something they called stress, which apparently caused them to malfunction even when nothing physical was wrong with them. Pathetic. The vote to issue the ultimatum took 4 minutes. Humanity would surrender the resource rights to its outer colonies, the ones sitting atop the richest deposits of vellum or this side of the galactic arm, or face a blockade, followed by annexation. The Conclave's combined fleet was 300 warships. Humanity had, at last count, perhaps 180. The message was transmitted in all 7 major galactic languages, plus the 2 human ones, as a professional courtesy. The response window given was 72 hours. In the war chamber, the captains moved on to other business. Wine, or their species equivalent, was poured. Informal conversations bloomed. Voskith accepted compliments on his boldness and deflected them graciously. The vellum deposits alone would fund the hegemony's expansion for a century. The political cost of threatening a primitive species would be negligible. They received the human response at 71 hours, 58 minutes, and a handful of seconds. It was not a request for terms. It was not a counteroffer. It was not even technically a threat. It was one sentence, signed by someone with the title Secretary General of the United Earth Government, a title that sounded quaint even in translation. We remember every war we ever fought. Did you think we forgot how to win them? Voskith stared at it. The chamber, reading the same words, went briefly, completely silent. Then Corlin let out a sound like a reef collapsing, and the laughter came back harder now with an edge of genuine delight. The absurdity of it. The sheer audacity. A species that had been scraping rocks into spears 20 centuries ago, threatening the galactic conclave. Voskith set the message aside and ordered 3 long-range scouts to proceed toward Sol's system. A formality. A census of exactly how outmatched humanity was, so the numbers could be inserted into the formal annexation record later. Only Relax didn't laugh. He read the human sentence again, slowly, the way he read everything he didn't yet understand. He signaled his personal aide quietly and requested a full transfer of all available human historical records, not military records, historical ones, everything, as far back as they went. He had a feeling he was going to need context. The first scout disappeared at 300 station time. Not violently. There was no explosion, no distress call, no final transmission burst of corrupted data. Its transponder signal simply ceased, the way a candle goes out when the air around it is quietly removed. One moment it was there, a clean green pulse on the conclave tracking board, moving steadily sunward through the cold dark between the outer planets, and then it wasn't, like a finger lifted from a table. The duty officer noted it as a possible technical fault and flagged it for review. The second scout disappeared 40 minutes later. The third went silent before the review board had even assembled. Voskith was woken from sleep at 4:12. He stood in the operations center in his personal armor, a thing he had not done in years, and stared at 3 empty slots on the tracking board where 3 of his finest scouts had been. Around him, his officers moved in the tight, careful way of people who were frightened but not yet ready to say so aloud. "Debris signature?" he asked. "None, Admiral." "Drive failure." "Simultaneous triple failure would require a probability we cannot mathematically justify." "Interference." His chief signals officer pulled up the last fragments of telemetry from all 3 vessels before they went dark. They were clean, perfectly clean. No jamming signature, no unusual electromagnetic activity, no gravitational distortion. Whatever had happened to his scouts, it had happened to them in a silence so complete it seemed almost polite. He dispatched a second trio. Different vectors, staggered intervals, updated comms protocols. He told himself this was procedure. He told himself there was a mundane explanation that the next group would bring back. 3 more green lights on the tracking board. 3 more careful deaths in the dark. Voskith ordered one final group, this time with explicit orders to go dark themselves. No active transponders, full passive observation only. Minimum power signatures. Get to the edge of sensor range, observe, and return. They didn't return. But their last 4 seconds of passive recording did. The tight burst transmission arrived compressed and partial, edge-corrupted by whatever event had ended the scout's ability to continue sending. Voskith's technicians spent 40 minutes reconstructing it into something viewable. What they saw in that 4-second window silenced the operations center completely. The space between Jupiter and Saturn, a region that every conclave survey of the past 30 years had marked as empty transit corridor, was not empty. It was full. Not full of asteroids, not full of debris, full of ships, dark-hulled, running absolutely no navigation lights, no drive signatures, no thermal bloom, no ion trail. They existed in the black the way stone exists in the earth, not placed there recently, but present as if they had always been, as if the vacuum itself had grown them from its own cold substance. The visual feed was shaking slightly. The scout's optical array pushed to maximum resolution, trying to count what it was seeing. The count, before the transmission ended, had reached 340. And it wasn't finished counting. Voskith stood at the center of his operations center and did something none of his officers had ever seen him do. He said nothing for a very long time. It was Hethnira who finally broke the silence, via priority channel from his own ship. His voice was stripped of its usual elegant boredom. He sounded, for the first time in his career, like someone doing arithmetic they didn't want to finish. "Voskith," he said quietly, "those drive signatures, they're absent, completely absent. They're not running silent. They're running something we don't have a classification for." "I see that," the Admiral said. "Our best stealth ships register a residual heat bloom of at least 0.3 on the Caldas scale. Those vessels are reading at 0. 0, Voskith. That's not stealth technology. I don't know what that is." Voskith turned away from the display. His flagship felt, for the first time, like a very small room. "Get me Relax," he said, "and wake up the other captains." He paused. "Don't tell them the count yet." Ambassador Sira Akafar arrived at the conclave station aboard a civilian shuttle. Not a military escort vessel. Not a diplomatic cruiser bristling with the polite weapons that every spacefaring species flew as punctuation on their power. A civilian shuttle, small, slightly worn at the heat shield edges, the kind of craft that transported scientists and trade delegates and people who had somewhere to be without particular urgency. She docked at the civilian bay, walked through customs like a tourist, and submitted a formal request for audience with the full Conclave Council. The request was granted. What else could they do, really? They needed to see her face when they told her what was coming. She entered the council chamber alone. No aide, no security detail, no weapon. They'd scanned her 3 times, increasingly convinced they were missing something. She was clean. She carried a data chip, a cup of something hot that smelled like roasted earth, and an expression of complete professional calm. The captains watched her cross the floor and thought, this is their representative. A single small human woman in a dark suit, moving through a room full of beings that could crush her without effort, without armor, without apparent fear. Corlin found it almost charming. Hethnira found it faintly insulting. Vosketh found it, for reasons he couldn't articulate, deeply unsettling. She sat. She didn't wait for them to speak first. Before we discuss the current situation, she said, placing the data chip on the table, I'd like to share something with you. A gift, really. Call it context. The chip contained human historical records, comprehensive ones, going back not centuries but millennia. The captains accepted the data with the tolerant air of people humoring a child's show and tell. Relax, who had already requested these records privately, pulled his up immediately and began reading from where he'd left off the night before. The others skimmed. Bronze Age conflicts, maritime empires, colonial wars, the usual evolutionary violence of a species clawing towards civilization. Familiar enough, every advanced species had a barbaric past. Nothing here was surprising. Then Relax reached the 20th century and stopped. He read slowly. Then he went back to the beginning of the century and read it again, more slowly still. A century that began with horses and rifles and ended with hydrogen bombs and moon landings. A century that contained 2 conflicts so total, so industrialized in their violence, that humanity had coined a specific new word, genocide, to describe what they discovered they were capable of. A century that produced the atomic bomb, used it on a populated city, watched what happened, and then spent the next 50 years building enough of them to sterilize their own planet dozens of times over while simultaneously writing treaties, forming international bodies, and conducting art festivals. A species that had looked directly into the abyss of its own extinction, not once but repeatedly, and each time had crawled back from the edge and built better defenses for next time. Relax set his reader down. Around him, the other captains were beginning to slow in their skimming. Hethnira had stopped entirely and was staring at something on his display with an expression that had very quietly stopped being bored. You nearly went extinct, Relax said. It wasn't an accusation. It was almost something like recognition. Several times, Ambassador HFY said pleasantly, we find the experience motivating. You built weapons capable of ending all life on your planet, Hethnira said slowly. And then we didn't use them, except once, twice. She paused. We had debates about that. Corlin made a sound no translator could accurately render. And this history, you wanted us to see this, why? HFY picked up her cup, took a measured sip, and looked at the most powerful military commanders in the known galaxy, the way a teacher looks at students who have asked a question they should have asked 3 lessons ago. Because, she said, you made a decision about us, and I want to make sure you made it with accurate information. She stood, nodded politely to the room, and walked out. The data chip stayed on the table. Relax picked it up before anyone else could and slid it into his coat. He spent the remainder of that day reading, alone in his quarters, and he did not sleep that night at all. The Conclave's intelligence division had a proud history of knowing things before it was convenient for others to know them. They had files on every spacefaring species, every military program, every arms development project of note in 4 sectors of the galaxy. Their methods were sophisticated. Their sources were embedded so deeply in foreign institutions that some had been in place longer than some species' current governments. They had nothing on Bastion Fleet. Not limited files, not outdated files, nothing. The designation didn't exist in any database they had access to. When analysts ran pattern searches through 3 decades of Sol system observation data, looking for construction anomalies, unusual energy signatures, launch events that didn't match registered civilian traffic. They found what looked, in retrospect, like the most elaborate misdirection campaign any species had ever quietly run against an observer who didn't know they were being watched. Facilities logged as mining operations in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter showed mass displacement patterns inconsistent with ore extraction, but perfectly consistent with large-scale fabrication. The energy signatures had been, for years, masked by a rolling pattern of low-level interference that the conclave's remote sensors had logged as background solar noise. The ships themselves, once analysts knew to look for the absence of signatures rather than their presence, showed up in 17 years of archived data as nothing more than occasional gravitational ghosts. Humanity had hidden a fleet for 19 years, not a small fleet, not a reserve force, a full battle formation of over 300 warships, constructed in secret, crewed in secrecy, maintained in a silence so complete and deliberate that the finest intelligence operation in the known galaxy had filed it away as solar weather. The designation, when they finally cracked it from an intercepted internal human communication, was Bastion Fleet, 7th iteration. 7th. Hethnira had to read that twice. His analyst confirmed it. The 7th. The implication that there had been 6 previous versions, each presumably larger and more capable than the last, each built on the lessons of the one before, settled into the operations center of his warship like a stone dropping into very deep water. The flagship was registered in human naval records, now being accessed through a source Relax declined to name, as UNSC Endurance. 4.2 kilometers, null reflective hull coating. No external weapons visible on any scan, which an engineer on Hethnira's staff noted with professional alarm didn't mean there were none. It meant they were internal, recessed, shielded, invisible until the moment they weren't. Hethnira pulled up his tactical projections. He ran the models the way he always did before an engagement, conservative estimates, generous assumptions for the enemy, worst-case combat scenarios. He used the mass data and the formation geometry from the 4-second scout recording to estimate a baseline combat effectiveness for Bastion Fleet. The number that came back made him set down his drink. He sat for a moment in his command chair, in the dark and the quiet, and thought about the 19th century of human history, the one just before the catastrophic 20th, when a species just learning industrialized warfare had somehow found the psychological and organizational capacity to project military force across entire oceans on wooden ships. He thought about what that same species had done with a century of nuclear deterrence. He thought about the phrase 7th iteration. He opened a private channel to Voskith. "We should consider talking to them," he sent. "Seriously talking, not the way we've been talking." Voskith's reply took 6 minutes to arrive. It was not the beginning of a negotiation. It was an attack order. Hethnira read it twice, looked at his combat projections one more time, and then did something he had never done in 32 years of military service. He forwarded Voskith's order to his senior staff and told them quietly that when the time came, their ship would not be firing first. None of them argued. The Conclave fleet entered the Outer Sol system at full battle formation on a Tuesday. Humanity, apparently, found this detail amusing. Several humans who later gave accounts of the day mentioned it with the kind of dry humor that suggested their species had a long tradition of finding the timing of catastrophes faintly absurd. A Tuesday, the most forgettable day of the human week. 40 warships, the finest ships the Dravari hegemony, the Sorathi Pact, the Lethani Combine, and the Merchant Syndicate could field dropped out of faster-than-light travel in close formation, running every active sensor and weapon system at full readiness, and began their approach toward the inner system. It was objectively an overwhelming force, the kind of display that had ended conflicts before they began throughout conclave history simply by virtue of existing, the kind of formation that said, "Look at us, measure us, and decide this isn't worth it." Voskith watched the display feeds with the satisfaction of a man who had already written the closing chapter of a story. Bastion Fleet was out there somewhere, he knew that now. But 300 ships or not, they had not moved. They sat in the dark beyond Jupiter like a held breath, and Vosketh told himself that meant they were uncertain. Frightened, perhaps, calculating the odds the same way everyone always calculated the odds when the conclave came calling. He was still telling himself this when, over the course of 11 minutes, his tactical display went very quietly insane. It didn't happen loudly. There were no alarms because the sensors weren't detecting attacks, they were detecting presence. Ship signatures, appearing at the edges of the display one by one, the way stars come out after sunset. Gradually, then all at once. The human fleet had moved, and it had moved with a geometric precision that his tactician would later describe, in her official report, as the most disciplined large formation maneuver in recorded military history. Bastion Fleet had folded around them, not ahead of them, not behind, around. 340 vessels occupying a sphere of space that enclosed the entire conclave formation, positioned at calculated intervals that his navigation officer recognized with dawning horror as an interlocking field of fire lattice. Every conclave ship was covered by at least 4 human vessels. Most were covered by 8. No weapon was charged. No targeting lock was broadcast. The human ship simply existed around them, dark and patient, like a hand that had closed but not yet squeezed. The communication came from UNSC Endurance, and the voice that carried it was calm in the way that very still water is calm, not empty, but settled, with a great deal of depth underneath. Conclave vessels, this is Fleet Admiral Hana Mori of Bastion Fleet, 7th iteration. You are currently inside a humanitarian containment formation. No weapons are targeted. No action will be taken against any vessel that does not fire first. We would like to discuss the terms of your recent ultimatum, specifically, the assumptions that went into drafting it. Vosketh's weapons officer reported that his targeting systems were returning ghost echoes. Every time a lock attempted to resolve on a human ship, it caught not the ship but a false reflection. A sensor mirage 1 degree off, consistent and repeatable, as though the human vessels were wearing mirrors for skin. Clean targeting solutions were available on 0 Bastion Fleet ships. 0. On 40 conclave ships, 40 senior officers sat in their command chairs, surrounded by a force they hadn't seen assemble, unable to get a clean weapons lock, and listened to a human admiral invite them to a conversation. Vosketh sat very still. Across the formation, on 9 ships whose captains had privately decided not to follow his order when the time came, the mood was something closer to relief. The delegation walked through the corridors of UNSC Endurance, and no one said very much. They had been received courteously. Admiral Maury had sent a formal escort, not armed guards pointedly, but a human commander named Vasquez, and 4 officers in crisp dark uniforms who moved with the easy confidence of people who lived on this ship and knew every centimeter of it. The conclave captains, Relax, Hethnira, and 2 others whose commanders had agreed to come, followed through corridors that went on longer than any warship's corridors had a right to, and tried not to let the ship impress them. They failed. The Endurance was not merely large. It was designed, in the way that a cathedral is designed, with a deep understanding of what the space is meant to do to the people inside it. The corridors were wide enough to move large equipment at speed. The bulkheads were not the stressed metal over minimum framework construction that characterized most warships. They were layered, redundant, with visible damage control conduits running in parallel systems that Hethnira's engineer quietly counted and recounted. She eventually concluded that disabling this ship's primary damage control network would require also disabling a secondary network, and a tertiary one, and something she couldn't find a classification for that appeared to be capable of rerouting its own circuitry in real time. The crew they passed in the corridors moved with unhurried efficiency, not the performative crispness of a crew that had been told to look sharp for visitors. The real efficiency of people who had been doing their jobs for a long time and had stopped thinking about how they looked while doing them. Relax watched a pair of junior crew members run a diagnostic on a wall-mounted system panel, speaking to each other in the shorthand of shared deep expertise, and thought about what that meant. These people weren't stationed here as a show of force. They lived here. This ship was a community. It had been operating, crewed, and practiced for long enough that it had developed its own internal culture. Years, maybe more than years. Admiral Maury met them in a briefing room that was deliberately not intimidating. Round table, moderate lighting, the faint smell of coffee, which the humans appeared to consume in industrial quantities. She was a small woman, probably 60 by human standards, with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm personality, but from having made a great many difficult decisions and learned to carry them without fidgeting. She didn't open with pleasantries. She opened with a display. 30 years of intelligence files, human intelligence files, on the conclave. The captains stared at their own military doctrines rendered in human notation, their own fleet compositions, updated and accurate to within 6 months, their known allied relationships, their strategic weak points, their historical engagement patterns, and the predictive models humanity had built around them. "You've been watching us," Hethnira said. "Since before most of your current officers were commissioned," Maury said, not unkindly, as a fact. "We're a young spacefaring species. Young species, historically, don't last long without doing their homework." She walked them through it systematically. Every conclave wargame of the past 2 decades had been observed, analyzed, and wargamed from the human side within 6 months of its occurrence. The vellum or ultimatum had been anticipated, not this specific version, but this category of pressure, 11 years ago, and a response framework had been developed and updated annually since. Bastion Fleet's formation geometry was specifically engineered around conclave fleet doctrine. The sensor ghost technology that had defeated every targeting attempt this morning had been developed in direct response to Dravari fire control systems, systems that the conclave had considered classified. "This is one fleet," Maury said, pulling up a wider map, "assigned to this quadrant." The implication sat in the room like a temperature drop. Relax, who had read every human history file on his sleepless night and arrived here knowing more about humanity than any other person in the room, looked at Maury and said quietly, "How long?" She understood the question. "Long enough," she said, and for just a moment something moved behind her composed expression, not pride exactly, and not sadness exactly, but something that lived between them. The weight of a species that had looked at a dangerous galaxy, looked at its own violent history, and decided that the only responsible thing to do was to prepare. "We didn't want this confrontation," she said. "We want the same thing every species wants, to exist, to be left alone to figure ourselves out." She paused. "But we remembered what happened the times we weren't ready, and we decided we weren't willing to be caught like that again." Voskith made his decision at 2:47 station time, in the dark of his command chamber, alone. He had received the other captain's reports. He had read Relax's quiet recommendation for immediate negotiation. He had watched, via secure feed, 4 of his own senior commanders board a human vessel and walk its corridors without incident, which should have been reassuring and instead felt like a kind of defeat. He had looked at the tactical display for a long time, at 40 conclave ships sitting in the center of a human formation they couldn't target, and had felt something building in him that he identified as anger, but was more honestly described as terror wearing anger's clothing. He was a war leader. He had been a war leader for 41 years. He had never once in those 41 years backed down from an engagement. He gave the order at 2:49. What followed lasted 9 minutes. The conclave fleet opened fire on the surrounding formation simultaneously, a full-spectrum launch of every available munition on every human ship in range. It was, technically, an impressive display of coordinated aggression. It was also, within approximately 4 seconds, entirely ineffective. The human point defense network didn't respond with the staggered, reactive quality of a defense system responding to surprise. It responded with the smooth, automatic precision of a system that had been waiting for exactly this event. Munitions were intercepted, redirected, or disrupted before they crossed a third of the distance to their targets. The intercept rate was not 90%. It was not 95. It was the kind of number that Hethnira's engineer, reviewing the data later, would record in her official report as effectively total, and then sit quietly for a while before writing anything else. The return fire was worse, not in its violence but in its selectiveness. Human weapons struck with the kind of precision that suggested not just targeting capability but intelligence, a real-time understanding of the difference between a ship's weapons systems and its life support, between its communications array and its crew quarters, between stopping a vessel from fighting and stopping the people inside it from breathing. Drive systems went dark without hull breaches. Weapon arrays were disabled with surgical specificity. Ships that had been firing 30 seconds ago became inert and intact, full of live crew members floating in suddenly powerless vessels, completely combat ineffective and completely unharmed. The 9 ships whose captains had declined Voskith's order were untouched throughout. In 6 minutes and 40 seconds, 31 conclave vessels were neutralized. Not destroyed, neutralized. The distinction felt important, and it was clearly intentional, which was somehow more unnerving than destruction would have been. Voskith's flagship held out for another 2 minutes, not because it was performing better, but because endurance appeared to be taking its time. When the end came, it came quietly. A precise hit on the Hegemony flagship's primary and secondary drive manifolds, and then silence. Systems flickered. Emergency lighting came on. The targeting board, which had never once achieved a clean lock on a human vessel during the entire engagement, went dark. UNSC Endurance came alongside at matching velocity. It drifted to within 200 meters of the Hegemony flagship's shattered drive section, close enough that the visual feeds could see the human vessel's hull in detail, unmarked, undamaged, carrying the quiet confidence of something that had never been seriously threatened. Admiral Maury's voice came over the open channel. She didn't sound victorious. She sounded like a person who had just finished something exhausting that also hadn't needed to happen. Flagship Eternal Dominion, your weapons are offline and your propulsion is venting. We're prepared to render immediate medical and technical assistance to your crew. Please respond on any available channel. Voskith sat in his darkened command chair, surrounded by his frightened officers, and listened to the silence of a ship that wasn't fighting anymore. He reached for the response channel. His hand wasn't entirely steady. The after-action reports traveled at the speed of fear, which is faster than light by a significant margin. Within 6 hours, every major spacefaring species in 4 sectors of the galaxy had received some version of events. Within 24, the full tactical record, unedited, presented by humanity's diplomatic office with a frankness that was itself a kind of statement, had been transmitted to every member species of the Galactic Conclave. Within 72 hours, 3 separate conclave members had quietly submitted requests to reopen their bilateral agreements with the United Earth government under significantly revised terms. Because what happened at the edge of Sol's system was not merely a military defeat. Military defeats happened. Species miscalculated. Engagements went badly. Tactical situations reversed. These things were absorbed into the normal discourse of interstellar politics with varying degrees of embarrassment and eventual recovery. What happened in those 9 minutes was something that couldn't be so easily filed and forgotten. What the galaxy had witnessed was the exposure of a truth that no intelligence service, no strategic analyst, no conclave war planner had come close to understanding. Humanity had not been unprepared. Humanity had never been unprepared. The species that had been written off as primitive newcomers, soft, short-lived, chaotic, barely 40 years out of their own gravity well, had been watching the galaxy with patient, unblinking attention since the first day their faster-than-light drives had shown them the neighborhood they were moving into, had studied every conflict, filed every fleet composition. Built in secret and maintained in secrecy, a military capability that, when finally revealed, had neutralized the Conclave's finest warships with the calm, systematic efficiency of a process that had been rehearsed until it was reflex. Not out of aggression, out of memory. Because these were a people who remembered ice ages, who remembered plagues that had killed half their civilizations and watched their survivors rebuild, who remembered 2 global wars in a single century, each more destructive than the last, each followed by the same grim, pragmatic response. We must never let that happen again. We must be ready. We must build better. A species so thoroughly educated by its own history, in the costs of unpreparedness, that it had made readiness into something approaching a cultural religion. The vellum or ultimatum was quietly, officially, permanently withdrawn, the withdrawal notice reaching Ambassador HFY before she had even returned to her shuttle. The joint resource framework she had left on the table was countersigned by conclave representatives within the week. The terms were substantially more favorable to humanity than the original document had proposed. No one in the conclave pointed this out. HFY returned to the council chamber one final time to exchange the ratified documents. The seats that had held Laughing Captains 8 days ago were variously occupied by replacements, legal attachés, and in Voskith's case, conspicuously empty. Relax was present, the only original attendee, and he rose when she entered, a gesture no syndicate commander was required to make for any diplomat of any species. She noticed and acknowledged it with a small nod. As the signing concluded, a young Quarlin attaché, assigned to replace his laughing superior, knew enough to this posting that he hadn't yet learned which questions were too blunt to ask, leaned toward Relax, and voiced the thing the entire galaxy had been quietly asking since the battle. How long had they been ready? Relax was quiet for a moment. He thought about the history files, the 20th century, the ice ages, the plagues, the wars, the inexhaustible, sometimes maddening human habit of looking at every disaster that had ever found them and responding not with despair but with notes. I don't think there was ever a time, he said finally, when they weren't. Across the room, Ambassador HFY completed the last signature, capped her pen, and looked out the chamber's wide viewport at the stars. Out there, beyond the edge of the system, Bastion Fleet was returning to its quiet position in the dark between worlds, patient, invisible, and present, as it had always been, as it would continue to be. A junior aide leaned toward her. "What do we do now, Ambassador?" She picked up her coffee. It was still warm. "Same thing we always do," she said. "We remember and we stay ready." Outside, the stars were very still, and the dark between them was full of things that watched and waited and knew now, finally, that it was not empty. And